Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Benjamin, and I am a textile and fiber artist living in Los Angeles, California. And I have a new tutorial for you today. It is something that I've not shared on this channel before. It is a needle lace variety, and we are going to be making organic leaf shapes or leaf skeletons using this technique today. I have been working on a project for a friend that has been incorporating these leaf skeletons as basically an applique for a garment. And I figured, well, let's teach other people how to do this. What what are we doing? So it is needle lace. It is called Punto in Aria, or Venetian needle lace. And as the name suggests, this was created in Venice, and this was about originally founded in about the early 1500s. So this technique is hundreds of years old. Now, that being said, it was likely developed before the early 1500s, since things rarely just spring up out of nowhere, and techniques don't just happen. But I do believe that it became more popular and more prevalent in Venice in the early 1500s. Now, Venice is known for its lace making, along with places like Brussels. Um, so, this has a very rich history of technique and design. In general, most of the needle lace from that time period were for things like collars, ruffs, edgings, lace that would go onto garments, and it was usually pretty geometric, not as organic as what we're going to be doing today. Now, punto in aria, which is roughly translated into lace in air or needle lace in air, is named that for a reason because you work on a backing fabric with couched threads that once you're done, you snip away the foundation stitches and you're left with a free floating piece of work. It comes right off of the backing fabric. So, um, what you're going to need for this project is either, let's see, a piece of fabric that can be folded into quarters. I think that a really nice heavy duty canvas with a really close weave structure is best for this. They do make like a sticky plastic covering that you can use for that, or you can use like a heavy cardstock even. You can also use fabric, a single layer, and an embroidery hoop. I don't recommend this when you're first starting out because it's a little bit more fiddly when you're cutting out your foundation stitches, your couching stitches. Um, so this is something that I used just because I liked to be able to like hang it on the wall as I wasn't using it, and also, who doesn't love an embroidery hoop? The other thing I would say is that this little tightener screw gets in the way of this technique quite a bit. So that's another reason why I wouldn't quite recommend it. You can see this is my sketch from these leaves. We're going to be doing a different leaf today. However, I am using this piece of cloth that I just zigzag stitched along the outside to keep it from fraying too much. It's about 1 foot on either side, and when it folds up, it's about 6 inches of a square. You can do this larger. However, when you're starting out, I recommend starting smaller, just to get the techniques down before you jump into a really big project. The other thing that I would recommend is a heat erasable pen. If you want your image to be permanent on your backing fabric, so like if you want to create a template that is permanent that you're going to make a bunch of, then by all means use a permanent pen. What I would say is that that does usually bleed to the other side. So you're basically stuck with like this one thing is for that one pattern. So these heat erasable pens, last for a really long time as long as you don't get them too hot or erase them with friction. The name brand is Friction Pens, but you can get the non-name brand as well. It's a little bit cheaper. And you can get these at most office supply stores, craft stores, stationery stores, pretty much anything that sells pens. Um, I'm hoping there's enough ink in this for the tutorial today, but these are great. I absolutely love these. You're also going to need some embroidery needles, both a sharp point and a dull point. So I've got a nice sharp one here. That's going to be what we're going to put our couching threads through the fabric with. And then we're going to do the actual needle lace with a blunted needle. I just used a file to basically go along the tip of the needle and blunt it, because what you want to avoid is a sewing through your fabric or splitting stitches. If you do split stitches, it's not the end of the world, but it's kind of important to keep things fairly easy and clean if you use a blunted needle. You're also going to need embroidery floss in the colors that you want your project to be. I'm choosing this lovely autumnal palette. This is just normal cotton embroidery floss. We are going to be using both 6 strands and also 2 single strands. So, like a single strand of one color and another color doubled up. You're also going to need thread for your foundational stitches or the couching stitches. You're also going to want some nice scissors and some tweezers, because at the end of your project, you will be tweezing out all of your couching threads. And sometimes that's easier said than done. I like to use like the tweezers that you use to pluck hair. These work fine as well. These are some like craft tweezers. You can use your fingers if you would like. Just know that sometimes it's a little difficult. Optionally, like I said, you can use an embroidery hoop. It's not something that I recommend on your first go for sure. And also, you want a reference. You don't have to do a reference if you want to just like freehand something. That is totally your prerogative. But if you're trying to go after a very specific shape, then it's pretty important to have a reference. So, all right. So let's begin. To begin, you want to prepare your fabric for this project. So this is approximately a 1 foot square of a nice heavy duty canvas. It's an unbleached canvas. And what I've done is zigzag stitched along the edges to help keep it from fraying, because you're going to be manipulating this a lot as you go. Having that flexibility is super, super important and helpful as you do this kind of technique. Um, like I mentioned in the intro, they do make like a sticky plastic film that you can put on top of your fabric that helps protect it from you sewing through it. I will say I don't have that, so I don't use it. And I don't think it's fully necessary as long as you are cognizant of how you are placing your stitches and making your marks. You're going to fold this into quarters, so half and then half again. And the reason that you're going to do that is because as you stitch through, you're going to have a nice, thick, stable foundation. And then later, when we go to cut our stitches, I guess they're like both basting stitches, couching stitches, whatever you want to call them, you can open the middle portion and get your scissors through there, and it protects the work that you have on the front. So you're not cutting the work off from there, and then you're not trying to cut like tiny threads off from the back. So just kind of like a little thing that makes your life easier in the long run. The next thing that we're going to want is to transfer our reference design. I'm doing an oak leaf for this pattern today, and there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can freehand it if you like, or you can resize the image, and then on one of the quadrants, words, um, you can essentially trace the outline of your work. I do recommend putting your screen brightness on the brightest brightness that you can. Um, you can see I don't have it locked, but you can trace along that shape on your actual fabric. I'm going to go ahead and sort of freehand this using this as my reference. And then I will come back once I have my sketch done. I have my sketch here, and it is very loosely inspired by the original oak leaf that I was working with. And something that I would love to impress upon you with this technique is you're not trying for perfect. We are dealing with organic shapes here, and organic shapes do organic things. They are not perfect. However, use your power of observation when you are doing this. For these birch leaves that I made, I'll show you here. It's easier to see on this. There is a central vein on these leaves and then parallel branching veins that split off from that. It has a light serrated edge, which you can kind of see in some of these examples. That really fine detail is harder to get in this scale, but something just to keep in mind when you're making it. For this oak leaf, there is a central vein, just like the birch leaf. However, it has lobes around the outside, and then each of those lobes also has its own central vein, technically with its own branching veins that come out this way. Those are smaller and a little bit less necessary for this particular technique. But the other thing is that, at least for the example that I was looking at, only this top set of veins were directly parallel with each other. They were directly opposite each other from that central vein. The rest of them are staggered along that vein. So using that as a starting point or a reference helps make your project look a little bit more realistic. Yes, we are playing with thread and fiber, so none of this is going to be super realistic. But we can use our power of observation to create something that looks as real as it can using the materials that we're using. I'm not looking for this to be like, oh my God, this is an actual fake leaf. But I do want it to look real enough that it helps suspend some of that disbelief. Now, the birch leaf has a fairly simple kind of ovular shape with a point at the top. Oak leaves have a lot of roundedness to them, a lot of lobes, and we have interior curves and exterior curves, and this is going to help us determine our next step. So once you have your base sketch done, this would be the point where you would put like your plastic over the top of it if you're using plastic, but we are not in this tutorial. You're going to need your sharp needle and your foundational thread. I am using blue for this one because it contrasts with the colors that I'm going to be using for the actual piece of needle lace that I am making. Now, leaf skeletons tend to be bleached either by people selling leaf skeletons or by nature. Sunlight bleaches things, that removes the color. Not to mention, Most of the color in a leaf is in the plant cells themselves. So you've got your chlorophyll, your xanthophyll, your anthocyanin, the things that make leaves have color. What you're left with a leaf skeleton is the cellulosic membranes that are harder for the detritivores or the things that eat plants. It's harder for them to break down. So you're left with this structure that's a little bit more airy, right? Um, you can do this in gray, and you can obviously see that I've done that for a lot of these. However, for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be using these more colorful autumnal threads. Most of this is probably going to get covered in the weaving. This is not Punto in Aria. This is just me weaving through the Punto in Aria, which we'll get to later steps in this tutorial. Um, do what you want. If you want to make these bright purple, make them bright purple. If you want to make them all white, make them white. I'm filming this, so that contrast is not easy to see for you. So I'm using colors that contrast well with my backing fabric and with my foundational stitch. There's basically two different ways that you can go about this. One is to couch your foundational thread as you go, or put in your foundational stitches first and then weave through your foundation threads. So put in, oh, what am I saying? You're going to put your couching threads through first and then weave your foundational threads after. Couching threads, foundational threads. They're different. I'm going to do the technique where I put all of my couching threads in first, and then I'm going to go through and weave my structure, my foundational stitches in afterwards. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to do this, but first I like to get a long piece of thread, usually my wingspan, and I am going to double this up. I've got my two open ends here. I'm going to feed them through the eye of my, again, sharp needle. We're going to be going through this fabric. And I'm going to start down at the bottom here. And this is just like my first stitch, so I'm not going all the way through. I'm going to feed it about, what is that, an eighth of an inch, quarter of an inch below that point through the back, like so. I'm going to pull that, and then I'm going to pull it through that loop. That's going to secure that first stitch, and I'm not pulling super tight. We're not trying to cinch the fabric here. We're just trying to create basically a scaffolding that we can then run our other threads through. In order to get the shape that we want, we're going to be placing stitches in very specific locations that will then kind of guide our threads through. Because we have a lot of curves, we are going to be putting more stitches in than if we were to do like really straight angular lines, those anchor points. The next place I am going to put an anchor point is down at the base where the leaf meets the stem. And you can go from left to right, right to left. It doesn't really matter. And you can kind of see I am like very, very close to that, but we're not on top of it. Everything's fine. That was just the gate slamming shut. As you can see, we are just like a fraction away from that center stem. And I'm going to go about that same distance on the other side and pull through. At this point, it's up to you about if you want to go up the stem first or go around the outside first. It doesn't really matter. I sometimes like to go up and then go like back and forth this way. Sometimes I'll go around and then up and then fill in all these other places. Let's go ahead and do the straight line first. And something that I like to do is anytime that there is an intersection of lines, we want to do a stitch. It's an anchor point. That's exactly what we're doing right now. So I'm going to go up again here. And then down. I'm getting a little tangled here. One moment. There we go. And then there's another intersection right here. And you'll notice some of these stitches are quite close, and that's okay. Just pulled out my needle, unfortunately. It's harder to do this on camera than it is sitting down at my desk or hanging out. And again, none of this is super precise. It's kind of a vibes thing. But these points where the lines intersect, it's very, very important to have these anchor points for your threads, because when we're laying our foundational threads, we're going to be using these as basically points where we curve off or branch off, and they just add that little bit of resistance. You don't want to make these super wide, but you also don't want to make them super thin because you are going to be weaving through these. It's quite important. Now, I've already gone up this vertical point. I'm going to do my next stitch up here, and we're going to go ahead and come back down through to do our branching veins. Before I get to that top point, there's a pretty long section here that won't have any anchor point. So I am going to just kind of split the difference in the middle here. And instead of going directly across this way, I'm going to go up about 1/4 of an inch on the opposite side of that central line. And that's going to give me a place to take that thread through, and it will keep its tension there. That will be important later, and we will see why. Now, at the top here, we have a couple of choices. I'm just going to go to the left of that central vein, right below that curve, almost touching that curve. And then go up about 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. And that is going to be our anchor point for that top curve. What I'm going to do next is basically travel down this side to this point here, to this vein. So let's tack this top one first, this top lobe. Again, I'm just like to the left of that vertical line. And then just like that central vein, about midway through, to the left of that line, and coming up through there, and then just to the right of the line, about, again, a quarter of an inch, bring it down. Gonna go across, ignoring that old line. And there's another anchor stitch. Going up to that lobe here. Ooh. Sometimes that happens. Again, you're not pulling this tight, but you also don't want them to be super loose. Like so. I'm going to move down to this lobe. Do an anchor point at the top of that lobe. And now this length here is pretty long for just one tacking stitch. So I'm going to put 2 in here. So basically I'm splitting this into thirds-ish and doing exactly what I did before. Coming up on the left-hand side, down about a quarter of an inch on the right-hand side, and then on that final 2/3, coming up on the left-hand side, going down on the right-hand side, going across. And this one we could probably split in half, but let's go ahead and do thirds. Coming up on the right, down on the left. And this is whatever works for you, honestly. If you want to do it all jumbled up, do it all jumbled up. All right. Tack down this top lobe. Great. And I'm going to go ahead and get as much of that first layer done. And then I'm going to show you how to refine the shape. I'm not quite done with laying that first round down, but I'm running out of thread. So I thought this would be a good time to tell you how I deal with that. What I do is I just bring my thread up and hack it down. And of course, one side is longer than the other. But yeah, I just tack it down. Wow. and bring it down to the back. And I just let it hang. I'll trim it a little bit so it's not super annoying. But yeah, I just tack it off to the side. And I'm going to keep going, and then I'm going to come back to show you how we refine the shape. As you can see, all of the tacking stitches or the couching stitches are in place. It looks kind of cute, but also kind of chaotic. But you know what looks worse? The backside. Look, look at this. It's cuckoo bananas. It's crazy town. It's kind of cool too. Like, I don't know. I always like seeing the backside of stuff. Um, it's like, I don't know. It's like the sketching layer. For the foundational stitches or the scaffolding that we're going to be putting in place here, I'm using a stranded cotton. And what I'm going to do, I've taken a length that is about my wingspan, which is approximately 6 feet, or 2 yards, if you will. And I am going to pull 2 strands out. Of course, I have a fan going right now because it is warm. Okay, so I took 2 strands here. I'm going to hold them together. One moment as I do this off camera. Get my threads attenuated and together. And I'm folding that in half, just like I did before. Holding the 2 ends together, like so. And now I'm taking my blunt tip. Well. Now I'm taking my blunt tip needle. This is not very sharp. Like, yeah, if you jammed yourself with it, it would hurt. So don't do that. But for all intents and purposes right now, it's pretty safe. We're going to pop those ends through the eye of the needle, which again is easier said than done. Groovy town, Charlie Brown. And here's where we're going to start. We're going to start down at the bottom of the stem. This is a very short stem, which is totally fine. It's not nearly as long as these birch leaves. And what's important to note from this point forward is we are never sewing through the fabric. We're not doing that. We are basically gliding across the top of the fabric, which is why it's so important that you use a densely woven fabric. We're not using any silk. We're not using any like gauzy material. We're not using knit. We are not using anything that's going to be caught easily with your needle. Again, this is why that like plastic coating that some people use is really, really helpful. I don't have that, so I'm not using it. I'm going to go underneath that first couching stitch here. And with the loop that's at the end of my thread, of course, I'm already tangled. There we go. I'm basically going to secure that with a knot. All I'm doing on this first pass is I'm going to go around the leaf using my tacking stitches as a guide. I'm going to go clockwise here. So I'm up through that one, through that, through that. And for this, you're trying not to split your couching stitches. Okay. If you do, it's not a big deal. It just means that later when you are pulling out the couching stitches, that they're going to be more difficult to pull out. So you should begin to understand now why it's so important that you have so many points here. Because you're going to get a smoother curve if you have more of these couching points. This stitch I did a little bit too small, but that is okay. We'll make do. And again, we're just gliding over that fabric, but through those couching stitches. When you have these straight stitches here, you want to follow the line of your pattern. So I'm going in from the right to the left rather than going around from the left to the right, because that'll cause a twist. And we do not want to do that. No twists here. And I hear you saying on the other side of the camera, wow, that edge is so thin. We're going to be bulking this up, but it's easier to start thin and bulk up than start thick and not being able to do diddly squat about it. So the benefits of doing this kind of work on just a flexible piece of fabric like this rather than a an embroidery hoop is, for one, you're not going to get caught on the screw. Sometimes you get caught on the points, but those bend and are easier to move. But also, like, you can manipulate this. So if you're having trouble getting into one of your stitches, you can kind of bend the fabric to give yourself a little bit more flexibility. I will say this does take quite a bit of embroidery floss. So just be mindful that if you are working on a pretty large project, get as much of the colorway that you think you're going to need and then some. I can't give you exact amounts because it depends on the size of your motif, the size of your overall project, and how many strands you use. You don't have to use two strands. I do think that two strands gives you a little bit more flexibility in overall thickness of line. Okay. Okay. So I'm down here back at the base again. So how do we keep going? For this one, I am actually going to come around from the bottom to the top, like so. And I'm going to go ahead and basically start filling out the veins. So we're going to get up through that first stitch here, like so. And we're going to follow this vein. I'm going to go underneath that first exterior line and through that stitch and pull up. And then I am going to come back down by wrapping that thread. I am now going to come again from the bottom to the top through that thread. underneath that exterior thread, following this vein, up through that couching stitch, and again, I am coming back down, wrapping that thread. You do want to be somewhat taut with this, but again, we're not pulling it so tight that it gathers anything. Then again, coming from the bottom up through the top, those are our first two veins essentially done. Now we're on to these branching veins. So this is the first one, and this is the one that's going off to the right. So I went from bottom to top. We're going to follow along that line going through that couching stitch, and then below that exterior line and through that couching stitch, back down by twisting. And this is where being able to move things helps. And then you can actually just keep twisting around that other couching stitch. Like so. So you're actually kind of covering it. And then I'm going to come back around from the bottom to the top of that couching stitch along that central vein. We're going to go up to the next branching point through that couching stitch. And then same deal. And again, we're doing our best to not split our thread. We're not going through the fabric. We're just following the lines as we go along. Now, as you get comfortable, you're going to get much faster with this. But I've got to stress the fact that this is a slow process. None of this is going to be instant gratification, but it's worth it. It's very, very meditative. I'm going to go ahead and keep going. I don't have a lot of threads, so actually, let's do this one vein, and then I'm going to tell you what to do to add more thread. There's no rule on how many times you wrap, by the way, but I like to have like a pretty solid line. But what we're going to do is I'm going to take this thread and essentially guide it through down that center vein and then around the edge. And this is just me like putting the excess off the side, cutting a tail. This will get trimmed off later, but you're basically tucking in your ends that way. I'm going to grab another couple of strands of my embroidery floss. Do the same exact thing where you take your open ends, lay them together, Put them through your needle, like so. Do a better job with the loop. And then I'm just going to take where I left off around the foundational threads this time, creating a loop and tying that knot, essentially, slip knot. You can also just like weave an end through, hold it, and then keep working. But I find that's a little bit less secure, in my opinion. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of this stem done. Once I get to the top, I'll come back. At this point, I have done all of these veins here, and I am up at the top with my remaining thread. Now, you'll notice that we did like the twisting or the thread wrapping on these veins, but we haven't done it yet on the center because now that we've gone up that way, we can just come back down. So, literally, I'm just going to flip it around for my purposes here. And we're going to thread wrap all the way back down. And again, we want to get a nice density of wrapping. It's kind of subjective, but basically you just want to make sure that it doesn't look like any of the threads are loose. You want to see a nice healthy twist. I do recommend that when you've chosen a direction, so whether it's right to left or left to right, try to keep that going. It makes things look a little bit nicer in the end. And then as we get down here, we're going to get down towards the stem again. Trying not to split anything. It's easier said than done. But we're going to wrap down towards the base here, like so. Then we're going to go through that tacking stitch at the bottom and wrap back up this way. And last time I buried my end, I went to the left. This time, we're going to bury it to the right. And again, we're going to trim. Technically, at this point, you are ready to go. You don't technically need to do anything else. You could just start doing the needle lace stitching. I, on the other hand, am a big fan of doing a thicker exterior outline for a couple of reasons. I think it holds the structure a little bit better overall, and it helps lock in some of the other stitches that we've already done. So I'm taking the remaining 2 threads from my 6-stranded cotton that we've been using. And again, I'm going to come down to this bottom stitch here, go around it. I'm going to catch that loop. And I am going to start thread wrapping. And where I can, I'm going to go through those tacking stitches. And I'm just going to follow along that exterior outline, continuing to wrap stitches or wrap thread. And I am going to go through those tacking stitches that are holding curves in place rather than going around them, because I really want a nice clean outline. So while that doesn't really matter on those straight lines, it definitely matters on the outline. So you see those ends that we buried are getting wrapped up in this thread wrapping. And they will be further locked in place either by the solid fill that we'll weave or by the buttonhole stitches along the edge of the project or of the motif. And this is just thickening up that outline to about the same thickness as the interior lines. If you wanted to, you could do another round. And if I have a lot of thread left over, I will. I will definitely do another round. But again, this is pretty much personal preference of how thick you want the exterior. But I would say I would recommend no fewer than a minimum of that initial pass and one wrapping pass. Just for stability and integrity of the lace motif. If your thread gets tangled, welcome to the club. All right, so you can see how this is shaping up. I'm going to go ahead and keep doing the wrapping, and then I'm going to take a little break, and we will come back and do the fill-in stitches for the base leaf skeleton. I have returned. I have the framework done. As far as like the outlines go, and if we want to thicken up stuff, we can, but it's not truly necessary. I have loaded up again my blunt tip needle here with another two strings halved, so it's a total of 4 strands, and I'm going to start down at the bottom here. So what I'm actually going to do is kind of around the intersection and through our basting stitch, I'm going to catch my loop, and we're going to get there. What I am then going to do is essentially do extended buttonhole stitches, winding back and forth between two supports. So I'm going to go from this corner over here to this one, and I have my thread off and to the left, creating a loop, and I am bringing my needle underneath this post here and up and through that loop, essentially. And I'm going to make that a little bit tighter. I'm then going to go through, so my working yarn is facing down. I'm going to go through that loop again. So it's basically like two wraps. And I'm just going to tighten that. Now, I'm going to flip my work. And on the opposite side, I have my yarn coming around, or my thread coming around clockwise. And I'm going to take my needle underneath that loop, like so. And I'm going to do the same thing again, where I bring it through the loop again, flip my work, come back to this side. So my working yarn is creating a loop like so. I'm coming up through there. And I am coming up, let's open that up a little bit. Coming up through that loop yet again. Tightening it down. And then on this outside edge, I'm gonna come through just the same. My loop is like so. I'm gonna tighten it. I'm gonna come around that post again. Oh, and I'm caught. And tighten up that stitch. From here, let's see if you can see, there are little bits of thread that aren't getting wrapped. I'm going to go back down towards the base here and just kind of like how we wrapped our threads before, travel down that line, wrapping my thread. It's kind of hard to see on that scale, but you can see I made some little lace stitches, creating the cells. When I get to the base here, I'm going to take my thread and pop it through that basting stitch or that couching stitch down below. And I'm going to repeat the process going back and forth between these two lines. So I've got a loop of my yarn coming across. You can see it like so. I'm bringing my needle underneath, pulling it, and then I'm going to come back through that gap again, and we're going to tighten that up. So it's just about wiggling the thread a little bit, turning my work just to get a little bit of an easier angle. We're now on this side, so my loop is around to the left, coming through there. And I'm going to come through that gap again around. I know it's kind of messy looking. And we're just going to tighten that stitch. Okay. One more here. Come back around. Tighten up that stitch. And then I'm actually going to use this couching stitch right here as another anchor point as I do this final stitch. Coming back through. And now I'm going to work my way. It's really hard to see on this tiny little bit. Wrapping my thread around that central stitch until I get back down to the base. And then I'm going to travel up the stem using those couching stitches as anchor points. And this is where things can get a little tricky. Oops. This is a pretty irregular shape now. What I like to do is lock in an anchor point. So my thread is coming around this way. I'm going to create a loop. I'm going to catch that thread, kind of pull it tight, and secure a knot. So now I can take this, we have these two pillars, right? I am going to find a spot on the right side. I've got my loop, it's coming around, capturing it like so. I'm going to come around so it's a double twist. Do you see that? Okay. On my other leaves, I would go back and forth between these two. We can still do that on this side because there's not a huge gap between these two posts, these two foundational rows. So our thread is coming from the left, pointing down, and I'm going to scoop through underneath that post. So you can see I'm underneath the post and over my working yarn. And I'm going to pull that. And then I'm going to go around that stitch again. And I'm trying not to capture that blue stitch over on that side. So we get that double twist. Now, our space has gotten kind of small over here. So I'm going to end or do my next stitch right here. But I think I am actually going to use this blue stitch. Okay, let's do it this way. I'm going to use this blue stitch as an anchor point, this blue stitch right here on the lobe. I'm going to go underneath the blue stitch and over the working yarn. And that kind of tightens it. And then I'm going to go ahead and wrap back down to the stem. So I still have this gap right here that needs cells in it. And in order to do that, I'm going to work my way up the stem. And then up that vein, I'm just going to wrap a little bit. And then to create a knot, let's see if I can do this. I have my working yarn pointing away from me and then looping around. I'm going to come up from underneath, and I'm just going to create a little bit of a knot there. Now I can do the same thing, which is working yarn up and to the right, underneath the foundation row, over my working thread, and then I'm going to come back around again to create a double twist. And we're going to wiggle it. And now move back over to this side. You don't have to do the double twist necessarily, but it does make for a stronger stitch if you do, like so. Now we've got a much larger gap between this foundational row and this foundational row. What I'm going to do first is anchor us back down to the stem. So we're going to wrap, and I'm going to use that basting stitch for support. And now this is where the open work starts to look much better. So I've got my working thread right down the center, and I'm going to come around this right vein and come around. And instead of doing 2 wraps, I'm going to go 1 and 2. Flip my work. And I'm going to just hold that with my thumb and forefinger, so I'm like pinching the work. This is why working with a cloth like this rather than an embroidery hoop feels better. It's because you have a lot more control over your stitch tension. Now I'm going to go over to this side. I'm going to go around that basting stitch again. 1, 2, 3 wraps. I'm going to flip my work again. I just find it easier to work from right to left. If you can do it ambidextrously, wonderful. I cannot, or not easily at least. So I have my working thread pointing down towards me again. I'm bringing my needle underneath this right-hand side vein and above my working thread, creating a loop. And then I'm going to go around 2 more times. Oh, I just did something. Pay attention to how your thread is coming through that loop. You should be always working into the hole, not into the open air. So I just made the mistake of going um, through the hole and into the open air, and that undoes your last knot. So underneath into that hole, and a third twist like that. And then I'm going to use this previous knot right here as like an anchor point. So I'm going to go around that post at the same time as going. So let's do that. Let's do this correct. I've got my working thread going this way, away from me right now. And it's about to come out of my needle. One moment. Okay. I've got my working thread pointing away from me. I'm going to go around the previous stitch to use that as an anchor point. And then I'm going to go back through into the hole like so. And then I'm also going to wrap around that anchor point. And now I can turn my work again. Around this thread and over my working thread. Then I'm going to go underneath that post that I just created from the open side into the hole. And now we have a smaller space again. So I'm just going to do that one extra wrap like I did before. And then turn my work underneath that work, underneath that foundational row. And then back through from the open side to the hole side. Turn it around. And repeat the process. And then I'm going to do the last stitch around this corner here. And what I'm going to do, instead of wrapping back down, I'm going to basically slip stitch it down at the end there. And I don't have much thread left. So we're going to wrap that around this exterior line. For a little bit. And then what I would do is start over here to wrap around. Let's see if I can get in there. So do you see how this is kind of just like open thread? This is what I want to wrap around on the way back down. So I'll start by tying my thread here and wrap around all the way down to my stem. And you can work all one side first and then the other. It totally does not matter. You can do it bit by bit. On these larger sections, it can get really nerve wracking to do those really long stitches. But if you need to, you can actually add more foundational lines if you want. It's not necessary, but you can. And it's just basically finding an anchor point, and running a line of thread across, and then using that as your foundation to do these stitches. So I'm going to fill in more of this until there's a point where we can start filling in with some solid fill, and we'll do some weaving. So I realized as I was about to fill in more of this gap between this row and this row here is quite large. So I wanted to show you how to fill in this sort of gap without creating a new line, a new vein, right? And this is going to be a lot more like traditional needle lace ground. So doing your buttonhole stitches across and then coming back the other way. So we're going to be using this foundation row, this one right here, all the way across. So I'm going to just go in like I have been. My working thread is facing to the right, and I'm going to go underneath this foundation row, over my working thread, and I'm going to make that first twist. I'm now going to do two more twists. So get that in there. 1 and 2. And instead of going across to this side and creating another knot, I'm going to hold that previous stitch that I just made between my finger and my thumb and go back in the same way into this row. So my working thread is off and to the right. I'm going underneath that foundation row, above my working thread, and I'm going to go back into that space 2 more times. 1, 2. So you see I've created 2 cells now. I'm going to continue that process across probably 2 more times. You can do this longer with shorter gaps in between. You can do larger gaps between if you want. It all depends on what size cell you want. I find that this size, which is, I would say, about 1/8 of an inch, is good for creating plant cells. So that's what I would do. But if you want to make them larger or smaller, you can. You can alternate sizes, so do 2 and then 3 wraps. Yep, we're going to do one more wrap here with 2 stitches or 2 twists, like so. And then I'm going to come around the outside here underneath the foundational thread and above my working thread. And you have 2 options here. You can wrap around this way and do a row going the other way, or my preference is to essentially finish that thread or finish that row by wrapping between. And what this does is it helps secure those stitches in place. I'm going to do a third one on that one. like so. And then I'm going to come up to that point there, use that as my anchor. And now the gap between here and here is much less. So I can do that kind of staircasing pattern that I've been doing already here. So we'll start there. Again, I'm going to do 2 extra wraps. 1, 2. Come across to this side. 1. And I didn't quite get that full, but that's okay. We'll get it there. Then let's get into this gap. And do 1, 2. Come back around on this side. I'm using that as an anchor point again. I think I'm just going to do the 2 wraps on there. Oh, as I go off camera. Can you tell I'm out of practice on doing tutorials? And now this gap between here and here is pretty small, so we're just going to do those single wrap, or I guess it's 2 wrap stitches rather than the 3 wrap stitches. And then I'm going to use this as an anchor point and finish off that stitch. I think I can make it back down, wrapping those posts. And then I'm just going to wrap that extra thread along the stem there, that central vein. So that's how you do the bigger gaps. You just fill in like 1 row just along one side, and then you use that new post as a new foundation row, essentially. Now I'm going to fill in the rest of this, and we'll get back. Welcome back. It's been a few moments for you and a few hours for me. Um, you may notice that my voice has been getting progressively raspier throughout this video, and I think it's because I have a touch of laryngitis. Super, super fun. It's been a while since I've had something like this. So, yeah, kind of rude, huh, buddy? So, moving that aside, technically, you could be finished here. I have all of the cells put in place here, and you can kind of see how the fabric is puckering underneath. That's because as you wrap your threads and do the little twists and knots, it does start to pull the fabric on, like pull the fabric in on itself because the tension is increasing. Beans, Rowan, do you know that I'm videoing right now? Yes, they do. However, to combat that, what you would do is do a little bit of a buttonhole stitch along the outside, which I will show you how to do. But we need to do something else first for this particular technique, which is we're going to be putting in some weaving in the actual cells themselves. You can do none whatsoever. So this is like a very gauzy skeleton leaf. This one has a little bit of those cells left. This one has even more weaving. And then this one is completely solid. For the project that I'm doing, I wanted it to be like the states of decay of a fall birch leaf. And I honestly, I'm obsessed. This is probably my favorite. This is my most recent one that I've done. And not only because of the gradient of autumnal colors, but I've got some really lovely organic shapes in here, some really organic holes. I want to do something similar to this with this oak leaf. Now, this part is actually really easy, and for me, it's the most fun part because you get to get really creative with color and placement. Now, I'm going to be using these two colors of embroidery floss, and this one is a tonal that has some browns and some reds in it. And then this one is just a lovely, like, russet, reddish brown color. It's beautiful. I I love it. I may also use some of this leftover gold that I used for the underlayment of the cells, but I likely won't use a ton of this. Now, for this particular portion, what I'm going to do is just like with the others, I am going to take a couple of yards or 2 yards, one wingspan of thread, and I'm going to cut the same length of the other color as well. So I've cut a length from both of my colors I want to use, the variegated one and this russet orange one. And just like the rest of this project, I am going to be using one strand from each color. And again, like the other techniques, I'm going to line up my ends. It really helps if you're not standing in front of a fan. And these two embroidery flosses are slightly different gauges, but it really doesn't matter. You can go really thick with this if you want. You just need to make your stitches bigger. All right. And now I'm actually going to start not at the base here. I normally would, but I don't have a ton of room to do the weaving down here, so it's going to be harder for you to see. So I'm going to start up here where I've got a much larger amount of space here. So I'm just going to find an intersection point, and I'm going to choose basically two places to weave back and forth between. So I think I'm going to weave between this side, this cell wall, and this cell wall. So I'm going to choose that spot right there to do my slip knot. And here's the easiest thing. I'm going to go underneath that direction, and then I'm going to go back underneath the other direction. And then I'm going to just keep going back and forth. And again, I'm not pulling super tight, but just tight enough that the stitches aren't loose. And we're just going to infill these cells that we created. And I like to take my needle and kind of pack down the edges so I can really get a lot of thread in between. This is where I find having this setup with the cloth folded into quarters is so much easier to use than the embroidery hoop, because sometimes it's really hard to get underneath these threads. So you're able to like pinch and get in there. You can't really do that with the embroidery hoop method. So I'm going back and forth. Right here is a place where it kind of connects with another cell. So I'm going to go underneath on that side. And I'm going to continue there. And as I get to the end of a cell, and if I'm on the outside, what I'll do is just try to wrap that edge until I get to the next cell that I want to weave. So I think I want to do this one right here. So sometimes I'll just kind of go around and do a knot. Let's clean that up. And so we now have like a solid chunk over here that we're weaving back into. You're just going to weave up through And then back to the other side. Back through. And this is a point where you will likely split your thread. At this point, it's kind of fine as long as you're going around those cell walls that we created. And again, we are not sewing through the fabric. At no point should you see any of your working thread on this side, and you should definitely not see it in here, but you can't really see at all because your tacking stitches are in the way. But everything's floating on top of this fabric layer except for those couching stitches and those tacking stitches. And this is very freeform. Just keep going. So at this point, I kind of have a choice to make of whether I come up through here or do one more stitch here, which I think I will. I'm going to do one more stitch on that side. I'm going to come up, and now I'll go around that other side. And since, I showed you the example, you can do a fully solid leaf, like so. However, I'm going to try to do something a little bit more like this, where I have a mostly solid ground, but I'm going to leave some random areas open so it looks really natural and organic. So I'm going to continue filling in as much of this as I can. And then when I'm done with that, I'll show you how to finish any of the raw edges with the buttonhole stitch. And we will then take it off and our leaf will be done. Oh my goodness gracious. It has been a couple of days in the real life, which is to be expected. This is not a quick process. This is very much something to be enjoyed and to just have like a very quiet, meditative moment with your crafting. We are at the end here of this leaf, or at least where I want to end this. I've left quite a bit of open leaf skeleton on this edge. In my mind, I imagined it that maybe it had been resting on this side, and this has gotten more of the decay and the little soil creatures munching on this leaf. So, the thing that you must do is to either finish your edges like so, by doing the weaving back and forth, or um, what you can also do is basically the buttonhole stitch along the outside. You don't technically need to do it in between where you've done the thread wrappings, um, unless you want a really like strong, robust leaf. Um, then you might want to do some buttonhole stitching in some like key areas. Hi, bud. I'm going to do this part of the tutorial with some cat paws in frame. Hold on, I need to get a grip. Um, where was I? Okay, Yeah, so if you want to have a nice, robust leaf skeleton that will hold its shape after you pull it off, then I highly recommend putting a buttonhole stitch around the edge. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So, throughout most of this process, I've been holding two strands of a six-stranded cotton together. This time, I am going to just pull one of the strands, and this I will hold double. We are still going to be using the blunt-ended needle for this. Okay. And I'm not going to bother with this small gap over on this side. I technically could if I wanted to. In fact, let's just do it, and then I'll show you how to travel across the um, the weaving to get to this other side. This one right down here, I've already thread wrapped pretty solidly. It was such a small area that I wasn't concerned about it. So to begin, I'm going to find my anchor point and go underneath that exterior thread and my anchor point, just like I've been starting our other rows of weaving and stuff. Gonna go through the loop and pull it taut. With the working thread going counterclockwise, so the part that's anchored is right here, counterclockwise, I'm going to take my needle, go underneath that rib, and underneath the working yarn. Basically, you're creating a loop. You're going to pull that taut, and that's a buttonhole stitch. Because this thread is so fine, it's going to A, take a little while to fully go across this bar, but also it's not going to be like too weird of a change in texture. Okay, so I just did that kind of fast, but working yarn is going to come counterclockwise. Going to take my needle and go underneath that bar as well as underneath that working yarn. That is buttonhole stitch. All right, so I've gone across that bar using my buttonhole stitch. And now what I'm going to do is head over to this side. So I'm just going to take a little path with my needle and slowly work my way through those through those stitches. We're just going little bit by little bit. And then I need to start there. So I'm going to go up this way. And come out right there. Sometimes you just got to brace your work if it feels like you're about to split a thread. All right. So now I'm going to buttonhole stitch from here all the way around to here. Then I'll probably just whip stitch like a couple of stitches across to get to this point, and then go all the way around up to this lobe here. All right, I've gotten to the point at the end of this bit of leaf skeleton that I'm going to just whip stitch around until I get to here. So just coming from below, just around that outside edge, a couple of stitches. Because we're using just a single thread that's been doubled, this buries itself right in to that weaving. But you're likely using thread that corresponds, so it's not really going to be that obvious anyway. Oh, Rowan's back. Hi, Bubba. I need you to lay down, okay? So I'm going to continue with this buttonhole stitch for the rest of this leaf skeleton. And when I am done with that, I will come back and show you how to remove your work from your backing. All right, I'm at the end of my buttonhole stitch. I played thread chicken like none other, and I'm just pulling that last little bit through. And trim that flush. Now, I also have the stem down at the bottom here. And I think I do want to buttonhole stitch that. So I'm going to grab my other single length of thread. And instead of starting in here, I'm going to start in this loop again. I'm going to pull that bit of thread through, catch my loop, and then I'm just going to do a knot at the end. And for this one, we're going to do the same thing. So I've got my working yarn coming counterclockwise. I'm going to come up underneath the stem and underneath the stem and over my working thread. Man, I think I've been saying that wrong the whole time, but you saw what I was doing. Okay. So now, there we go. Now that I'm down at the bottom here, I'm just going to stitch this in. Let's see. I might have better luck coming from below. Where were we? Just stitching this in to the work itself, and then bury your end in some of the solid weaves. And now snip. So, to reiterate, we have done the full leaf skeleton. We've done the solid weaving, leaving some open gaps, and then finished off with buttonhole stitch on any of these exterior areas that we want to keep its form a little bit better. Due to the nature of thread, this will want to crumple in back on itself. You can then starch these if you want, or press them. For the project that I'm working on, they're staying natural because I do want that organic curve. If I were to mount this in a shadow box or a frame, for one, I would use some entomology pins and some foam core, and then I would likely starch it so it stays perfectly flat. To take it off of your backing, you can technically cut all of these, or you can open it up like a little book and start snipping those threads. By doing this, it gives you a little bit more control over what you're cutting, and you won't usually, hopefully, cut into your fabric. You're just cutting all of these um, foundational stitches, the couching stitches. Get some nice cutting ASMR. Here, why don't I do this? And just go slow and steady. We're not in a rush. We just spent hours upon hours making this thing. We can do a few minutes of snipping threads. And the good thing that I'm seeing here, I'll talk to you again. I'll put the mic back where it was. Um, I'm not seeing any of the like threads I used to make the leaf skeleton anywhere in here. So that means we did it right. If you did see stitches at this point, well, I'm sorry, friend. You've got more snipping to do, which will be snipping the fabric away from your leaf skeleton. But if you followed these steps up till now, we should be golden. You could use a seam ripper if you wanted to, but you know, it's kind of whatever you've got lying around. And I've always got my snips around. I use these a lot. Okay, we are almost at the end there. All right. So there's the back, and then here's the front. And at this point, you'd think, hey, why is it still attached? Because you've got to pry this thing off gently. Pulling it free from the fabric. Snipping any threads that you might have accidentally caught. Looks like I only had caught 2. And then you're left with this kind of mess. From here, it's a lot of just picking it out. You can use your fingers. You can use some tweezers. Usually I can get them all out with just my fingers. Sometimes they're in there. This is really the only part that's particularly wasteful, and I would say it's probably less than 2 yards of thread. All right. I'm going to continue picking this clean, and I'll be right back. And here we are with the finished oak leaf skeleton, or partial skeleton. You can see the front and the back are equally finished. You can kind of tell that there's a front side and a back side, but honestly, it's viewable from both angles. I was able to get all of my couching stitches, my foundational stitches, out with my fingers. So not too bad, not too bad at all. And while this has a different destiny, it's not going to go on the same piece that these go on. Um, I'm very, very pleased. I think this would have its place on that garment if it were going on there, but it is not. I have other plans for this. I am super, super happy with this. I think it's absolutely stunning. It's delicate. Love it so much. I hope you like it. If you make one of these, please tag me on social media. I'm most active over on Instagram, so please check me out over there and tag me in your posts making these Punto in Aria leaf skeletons. I have had a blast making this tutorial. And if you enjoyed this and think other people might enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up and share. And then hit the subscribe button too if you would like to see more work from me. I'm going to be doing more stuff like this in the future. It's just kind of an inevitability. I like to make things, and especially things that are inspired by nature. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.